especially in 2025. We have so many risks going on now, whether that's, your traditional business risks, but then you have the whole IT space for cybersecurity. And then, we're transitioning into artificial intelligence. So how can internal audit A support AI within the organization? And then B, how do you incorporate AI into your audit plan? These are all things you have to think about. But I think it's really getting the input from the organization and then taking that input and driving it into your audit plan is certainly going to be the first step.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show we have Mike McDonald. Mike is the Chief Audit Executive at BorgWarner, and this one's a little bit different. So this is a webinar that we did as part of the Audit Analytics and AI conference. Typically, we would do the conference from 8 to 5, but that can be absolutely brutal to sit through virtually. And so we pulled some of the webinar sections and pushed them out a few weeks to make it a little easier. So this is one of those sessions. The session was sponsored by Supervisor. Supervisor is a plug and play analytics solution. So you got about 300 plus analytics to choose from. Go with Supervisor, plug it into your ERP, and then you've got 300 plus analytics potentially that you could be running. So check out supervisor.com for more information there. Thank you, Supervisor, for sponsoring this session as part of the Audit Analytics and AI conference. And then also coming up with the idea that we should run it as a podcast. Really appreciate that also. Mike has been the Chief Audit Executive at BorgWarner for around a year. He's going to go into more details about his experience, his past experience with BorgWarner and prior as part of the session, the webinar that we did. So I won't say much more than that, but he's been there for about a year. So largely the topics were being in that role now for a year. What did you expect? What did you not expect? What did you learn? First 100 days, that kind of stuff. And so it's still geared towards helping aspiring or current CAEs basically be better at their job. With that said, here we go. What's the, just for context, for those that don't know, team size that you have a BorgWarner, geographic location, maybe break down IT versus non-IT audit or analytics team, FTEs, things like that. So that as we talk about kind of your role as a CAE, somebody can go, okay, I get that because the context of the size of the team and the resources and
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah, so we're a team of 23 people. We're an organization of about 15 billion in revenue. The majority of that 22 people are CPAs. We have a small IT function. We do outsource a lot of our IT responsibilities. So we'll call it roughly 10% is IT. The other 90% is going to be CPAs and business process folks. As far as geography goes, the majority of our team is in North America, but I do have a regional team in Europe and I have a regional team in Asia. So out of the 23, we have around roughly 5 in Europe and roughly 5 in Asia, and the rest of it's in the US.
Okay. Now just walk us through the transition. Walk us through the transition to being the CAE. Were there nerves? Were you scared? Walk us through emotionally, Mike. Tell us how you're feeling. But no, seriously, what was the transition like? Smoothness and all anything you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's very evident is when you become chief audit executive of any company is your peer group is drastically different, right? So my peers are all the direct reports to our chief financial officer. So it's much more, as I mentioned, it's much more relationship building, making sure that we're setting the mandate the way it should be set according to our audit charter, which is scoping the right locations, the right processes, leveraging technology to identify risk within the company, right? I mean, as you guys know, in internal audit, we don't necessarily make decisions, but we are risk seekers and we present that risk to our customer. And then ultimately, my job is to present it to the audit committee. So, but I would say, Trent, to your question, what's very notable in the very beginning is my peer group is now what we call the SFLC, which is our Senior Financial Leadership Committee. And then, I'm tasked with presenting to the audit committee on a quarterly basis. And, they want to make sure that they have transparency into what's going on in internal audit, what's going on into the business. So my job is to make sure that, we are putting the right protocols in place to reduce risk as much as possible.
And then if a new CAE, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, but if a new CAE came to you or an aspiring CAE who's
Yeah.
looking to become a CAE, if they came to you and said, starting playbook, maybe like what the first 100 days look like, what kind of things would you share with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's if you are going to take on this role, you really have to understand the needs of the business, right? And it's not developing your audit plan with your audit team and only your audit team, right? I mean, that's I think one of the mistakes that any internal audit shop can make is that they're doing the entire scoping assessment themselves. They think they know the business. The reality is internal audit knows a little about a lot, but that's really to the extent of it, right? Because we touch into so many different functions and processes, but we're certainly not subject matter experts in anything. So the very first I would say rule of protocol would be is that you're reaching out to the business, your key stakeholders, and you're understanding from them what are the risks of the organization. Especially in 2025, we have so many risks going on now. Whether that's your traditional business risks, but then you have the whole IT space with cybersecurity, and then we're transitioning into artificial intelligence. So how can internal audit support AI within the organization, and then B, how do you incorporate AI into your audit plan? These are all things you have to think about. But I think it's really getting the input from the organization and then taking that input and driving it into your audit plan is certainly going to be the first step.
What about like I'm talking day one? If
Mm.
I'm gonna be a CAE tomorrow and I was like, hey Mike, what I mean, like day one, assuming my email works, you don't have access to systems, which usually doesn't happen. But let's just say I do. So all that stuff aside, in all seriousness, day one, what advice would you give? Like I would go do X.
Day one is I would walk through with your key stakeholders what your goals and objectives are, and to make sure that those goals and objectives align with the business, right? You are only successful, not even at the CAE level, but really anywhere within the internal audit space. You are only successful if you're identifying the risks within the organization and you're finding either developing the right or identifying, I should say, the right controls and processes to mitigate those risks. But you're working with the business. I think, maybe to add to that a little bit, Trent, is what the mistakes that an internal audit department can make is that they try to become more the police of the organization, the compliance of the organization, but they're not the risk advisory function. And I think what you'll hear from audit committees and you'll hear from the business in 2025, especially, is that internal audit needs to morph into an advisory function. You have to be still independent and objective, particularly when you're doing Sarbanes-Oxley work for those that are working for public companies in the United States. But you also need to be an advisor. And if you're seen as only the police of the organization, you're not going to get the input from your management teams because they're going to feel audited as opposed to feeling supported. So I think, Trent, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but the business has to feel supported from you on day one, and then you'll be successful as an audit group.
There's a question in the Q&A that it ties very closely to what you're just talking about, so I'll throw this at you. Um, Holly's asking, what is the department's charge? SOX, other reg compliance, cost savings, etc. What is the department's charge?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if we're talking the total amount of, I guess, like the composition or the percentage of the types of audits we do. Is that how I'm interpreting that question?
I think maybe more like what's your mission? What do you feel like internal audit's mission is there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the mission is to do as much advisory work as you possibly can. I mean that being we have a house document within our group where the very top of that house is you're an advisor to the organization. So I honestly I really can't emphasize that more. Today the audit plan is around, let's call it 60% compliance, 40% advisory operational work. I would say over the next 2 to 3 years, I want to flip that. And with that is, making sure that you're identifying how do you become more efficient in the compliance work so that you can spend more time on more of those, let's just call them value added activities.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into the other thing I wanted to talk about because everyone has a limited amount of resources, time, people. So how are you able to focus on what matters considering, I mean, nobody has all the resources they need.
Yeah, yeah. But it's I mean it's a hard question to answer, but the best way to really think about it is it all comes down to the risk assessment in your audit plan. right? So focusing on what matters is making sure that when you're planning your audit plan for the following year, you're addressing the needs of the business, right? So we know that, again, although the Sarbanes-Oxley coming from a US publicly traded company, we know that we have to do that, right? And we have to achieve certain percentages of coverage in order to be comfortable with our opinion in the 10K that we file. So that's kind of pushed to the side. But how do we make sure that we run an appropriate risk assessment so that we are prioritizing what we should be prioritizing? And then with that, Trent, to your kind of the second part of your question is on the resource side, is how do we adequately staff that? We don't have resources to do everything, so there's a balance between managing your budget that you're given, and to the degree that I need to outsource some of that work, we certainly do that. But it's prioritizing what is important. And let's say, for example, 2026, and we're just finalizing that plan now, prioritizing that work, making sure that we're properly putting internal audit resources on that work. And then on the compliance side, and particularly SOX, we outsource that work because I would call that less value added and more compliance specific.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about this in the Q&A also, and it's one that we had planned on talking about. KPIs, I think, are maybe one of the most common questions we get. What kind of KPIs are you looking at? How often? So just, I don't know, whatever your 100-foot view of KPIs are, and if there's any, certainly if there's any with any specificity you could speak to, that'd be great too. But
Yeah,
understanding.
yeah. So if I'm going to really get into the nitty gritty detail here, KPIs internally, we have what are called milestone dashboards, which is totally digitized in Audit Board, which is our audit software of choice. So how I measure team progress, at least from an efficiency standpoint, is our audit plan is, you send out your request list 30 days in advance. You have essentially 30 days of field work and you have 30 days of wrap ups. Call it 90 days on every single engagement that you do. So from an efficiency standpoint, all of that is tracked in Audit Board, right? We send out data requests in Audit Board. That's digitized into a Power BI dashboard. We have our field work, which clocks within Audit Board. And once field work is essentially done, which is through a closing meeting with the business, that gets put into Audit Board through a milestone. And then most importantly, I would argue by far, is are we getting audit reports out on time with quality, with strong recommendations and strong management action plans? So internally, as far as efficiencies go, I look at that weekly, right? So on a weekly basis, I'm logging into Audit Board, I'm logging into my Power BI dashboards, I'm seeing where we're falling behind, and I'm having those conversations with our senior managers and our audit director to make sure that we get back on par. Now that's internal audit specific. Now on the KPIs on how are we doing an internal audit, at the end of the year, we send out surveys to get the feedback from the business on, was the audit scope clear? Was the audit recommendations clear? Do you believe we mitigated the risks financially? Is there anything else that we can do better? We take that feedback and we're constantly revising the way we do things in the following year based on the feedback from the business. So I can't emphasize enough, Trent, to your question on, how are you successful as a chief audit executive? You have to get feedback from your peers and your customer to be successful. Do not take it out on your own. Don't take that task on your own because you're really not going to be successful unless you get other people's opinions.
Yeah, and it's no different than I've always said. Internal audits, just like this mini consulting, firm within an organization, and it's no different than a consulting firm or any other organization. Like if you don't know what your clients want or your customers want and need, and you're not giving that to them, it's probably not going to be super successful.
100% agree. Yeah, exactly.
I know, I know you've mentioned technology a ton and your use of it, and that's really, I think you've always kind of been the driver, or at least as far as I've always known, you've been the driver of doing things like full population testing, adopting AI
Yep.
safely, pushing for analytics. So, like looking back your career, what did you learn about like leveraging full population testing to find issues, drive impact,
Yeah.
find insights?
It's a very interesting question because as I've sort of matured in the space, full population testing is kind of a given now with the tools that we have. But it's not even so much about full populations as sort of the end of the finish line. It's the right populations, right? And I really can't emphasize that enough. And that's really where data analytics comes into play, right? And I would say Supervisor, the software that we launched this year, really helped us get to that finish line of auditing the right populations. Because you bring in, depending on the test, of course, you could have thousands of line items of populations, but how do you understand the risk in your ERP environment, for example, to pick the right data to test the right information? So I would say you have a successful analytics program if your analytics are demonstrating the populations within the full population that you should be putting a little bit more attention to. So, I think Trent, you kind of hit the nail on the head on. You got to do full populations, no doubt in my mind. But the next step is it's not really that. It's auditing the right populations, which are the areas that you see the most risk in, and that's where, from my perspective, working with supervisor, they were extremely helpful in that and extremely alert and on par and attentive to the details on what we did and what we needed to do in our environment. We come from a very decentralized business, so our ERPs are a little bit different across the board. So we work directly with supervisor on, this is our SAP instance, but really we need to redefine our algorithms or our calculations to bring in the right populations because that's where we should be spending our time. So long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's the right populations more now than it is full populations.
And if there's not much more to add based on this. I see there's a question in the chat that I want to throw at you. That's fine. I think you basically just covered it. We can move on. But Jim in the audience said that he just implemented supervisor. Would love to hear more about your experience.
Yeah. The experience has been phenomenal with them. I would say from a customer support perspective, um, they're there. I mean, they're answering your questions right away. And what I would say is what I'm most impressed with supervisor is their ability to customize the data you need. Right. I mean, it's an out of the box solution to start, but when we've done a deep dive of all, let's just call it the output of all the analytics, and we identified nuances within those analytics where we went back to the supervisor team to say, hey, we need to include, this particular population that wasn't part of it, or we need to exclude this part of the population because there's really no risk there. So I would say what I'm most impressed with supervisor is their speed to delivery and their attention to detail is better than the competition, which is why we use them.
Excellent. Okay. And this I don't know, Mike, you're like the perfect segue person I've ever worked with. Like every single time, like perfect segue into the next question. Um, but you have resources on your side that can develop custom analytics. So whether you're using Alteryx, Python, any of the kind of common tools that we've all likely heard of. And so you do have some folks that can do that. So how do you prioritize when you're going to build something in-house versus use an external tool?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question. You need to understand your analytics and your business enough to be able to distinguish between those two. So as an example, there are well, let's just use this example. There are a lot of nuances to manual pricing changes, right? You can have pricing changes that are done as part of pricing master file, but there's also changes that are done outside of pricing master. For example, at a sales order level, where analytics out of the box usually don't cover that. So the first step is figuring out what do you want your analytics strategy to be, and then I'm now a big proponent of outsourcing my analytics. I'll be completely honest with you with what we've learned with supervisor. But supervisor will have the limitations that are so customized and unique to the business that it makes more sense to develop those in house. And that example of changes that transpire at a sales order level, we said there's a lot of different conditions on how that happens. So that makes sense to internalize, pull the data sets ourselves, run it through Alteryx, and then visualize it in Power BI. And not only us, but our external auditor also leverages our own analytics tools to test those populations. So it's a complicated question. It's sort of a complicated answer, but you need to make sure that you can distinguish between what is sort of universal and that you can apply that to the full population, go use a third party analytic tool, and then what is very customized, where it's so unique within your individual, let's just call them legal entities, that you need to bring it in house because otherwise it's too complicated, if that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah. And especially having the competency of knowing the business and being able to do that certainly helpful when you have the team internally that can do that.
Yep.
Mentioned full population testing a couple times. Probably one of the biggest issues people have is actually I was just talking to a team about this today. So they're doing their version of what are they doing? Duplicate invoices.
Yep.
And they're like, we have 4,000 hits. What are we supposed to do with 4,000 potential
Yeah.
duplicate invoices? Because there's decent amount of work that you then have to do to whittle that population down. So for those that are curious, even something as simple as setting some kind of threshold, like, hey, if it's less than making up a number, 10,000, we don't care as much, especially when you have 4,000 of those. So anyway, um, how do you guys deal with that? So when the findings, there's a ton of those in there, but you can chase noise, maybe as one way to say it, in tracking down everything. Whereas it's like, no, we really just need to kind of whittle down the population and hone in
Yeah.
on just the good stuff.
Yeah. So one is what you just said, Trent, right? I mean, you certainly need to filter on what you consider to be material. And when you're talking duplicates, it's harder to have that conversation because it's money out the door. So you got to be careful on what you're putting the threshold on because presumably whatever organization you work at, they're going to want all their money back. So you'll need to think a little bit intelligently behind that. But, in your example of you're saying 4,000 different duplicates, clearly that's not correct unless there's a huge problem at the organization. So there clearly needs to be a whole lot of false positives that are in that population. You need to dig into the details, which is what we've done and exactly what we worked with supervisor on, right? Is an example of that would be, okay, if I'm looking at this particular duplicate and I happen to see that it's a duplicate, it's monthly duplicate. Well, hold on a second. Is that just a reoccurring payment on the same invoice, which has been set up contractually? So an example of that we see in BorgWarner is there may be insurance payments that we've contractually agreed that we're going to pay every single month for X amount of money. Well, that's the same invoice that we're constantly paying, and that's done contractually. So analytics, what I would say is they tell you the what, they don't necessarily tell you the how or how it's working. So you need to dig in to each of those within your your business unit or wherever your customer is and however you're structured. But you need to dig into those to understand what's causing those dupes and then go back to your analytics strategy and find ways to build algorithms to exclude that. And again, I can't emphasize supervisor has been extremely helpful for us in identifying what those root causes are and taking the noise out.
George has had a couple of questions. I want to try to get to one of those, and I feel like this is one that you are that we've talked about before. So George said, could you give a brief idea of the skilled personnel needed in a modern environment of an audit service? So, like, basically, what is I don't even know if we can call them the auditor of the future anymore. I think the future is here today. What kind of skill sets are you looking for in those folks?
Oh man, that's a question that we talk about at a very senior level all the time. And it's not even just audit, right? It's more the finance, accounting, audit space, in general. Oh, what I would say is I think where the world is going is they're looking at data scientists a lot more now, right? Data scientists with a business acumen are going to be a dual threat and they're going to be a very hot commodity in hiring is having that background because as you guys all know on the call, I mean data is becoming the most valuable commodity we have. So those that understand data, how to manipulate data, interpret, analyze, etc., and then you happen to have an accounting or finance background to boot, that's going to be probably the best suited person to come into our environment in the future. Data scientist for sure.
Yeah, it used to be when I graduated, like I got a tech degree, but it was out of the business school, and it was yeah, business meets technology, and you're good to go. And I guess I mean that's true, it's still true, but yeah, definitely I think you could add in if you added in another part of the Venn diagram, another circle, it would be data
Yeah,
these
yeah,
days. So
absolutely. And those with accounting and finance backgrounds, I mean, don't be scared. You can still learn data. You can still learn technology, and you can be a dual threat coming in on that side instead. Because AI is obviously taking off, but you're still going to need accountants. You're still going to need finance personnel. So those are still great degrees. But what I would be focusing on is data interpretation.
all right, we made it almost 30 minutes and we haven't had an AI question. So let's close with that and then we'll hand it over to Orion. How are you guys using AI? How's it actually helped your team?
Yeah, right now, I mean, we're not nearly where I want to be. So everyone within the internal audit space has the Microsoft Copilot 365, which we're certainly using within the audit space, right? Asking the right questions, uploading files, asking Copilot to interpret, let's call it contracts, for example. We have an in homegrown SDI application that was built by our IT team, and that application really is you can upload files into it, and then it's got a chat bot on it where you can ask questions on the files. You can even ask the chat bot to put like your testing procedures into columns in an Excel spreadsheet, and then the output of those questions can go right into the appropriate cells, so you can be efficient from a testing workbook perspective. But at a kind of a high level, Trent, we're using M365 and some homegrown chat bots as of today. And then Supervisor is going to be releasing, or they're continuing to release some AI on top of their analytics that is going to certainly support us in the future.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.